The Duke of Gloucester's final act wasn't a quiet farewell. It was a thunderclap that echoed through every wing of the monarchy. His will, long kept in a locked safe beneath Kensington, wasn't just a list of inheritances. It was a message, a decision that would redefine loyalty, legacy, and draw an unspoken line through the heart of the royal family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The day the Duke passed, palace bells tolled with a solemn reverence. Yet behind the stone walls of Buckingham and Clarence House, anxiety stirred beneath the grief. The Duke, revered for his unwavering devotion to tradition, had always kept his cards close. But few imagined the hand he'd revealed posthumously would leave the House of Windsor gasping. A sealed envelope arrived at the royal solicitor's office. Within it, not only the customary details of an aristocratic estate, but an instruction read this in the presence of the full senior royal assembly. And so, in a room thick with polished wood, velvet silence, and held breath, the Duke's last words shattered the illusion of royal unity. The room shifted the moment Princess Charlotte's name was uttered alone, without conditions, without companions, without apologies. The Duke had willed his entire estate, including ancestral lands, personal assets, and several royal relics exclusively to her. At just 10 years old, the young princess had become the sole heir to a legacy centuries in the making. What followed was not just murmurs of surprise, but a visible rift. Camilla's children, Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopez, had not only been overlooked, they were named and specifically excluded. No ambiguity, no oversight, a direct dismissal. The air turned cold, and even the most seasoned courtiers faltered in their composure. This wasn't a simple inheritance. It was a chess move, a signal that old loyalties had not faded, and that certain bloodlines, despite their royal proximity, were never truly accepted. Camilla's silent rage simmered beneath her carefully crafted smile while Charles remained stone-faced, straining to keep the calm. Behind closed doors, questions erupted. Was this the Duke's way of preserving the pure royal lineage? Was he making a final stand for the bloodline he believed deserved protection? Or was this a symbolic vote of confidence in a future queen, one whose destiny until now had been considered secondary? Palace aides could barely contain the fallout. In the hours after the reading, whispers moved faster than royal dispatches. Staffers exchanged glances, reporters loitered longer, and whispers of Charlotte echoed down private halls. No one saw this coming, and yet in hindsight there had always been signs, quiet gestures, guarded meetings, and the Duke's increasing closeness to the Wales household. Now, what had once been polite speculation erupted into something far more dangerous division, but what drove the Duke to such a deliberate and divisive choice? The roots of this royal shock run deeper than anyone expected. Behind the formality of titles and tiaras was an unexpected relationship, one that bloomed away from the public eye. The Duke of Gloucester and young Charlotte shared more than a bloodline. They shared moments, stories, and a bond that no one thought significant until now. Long before the reading of the will stunned the palace. Something had quietly taken root between the elder Duke and the young princess. It began with small gestures, Charlotte's quiet visits to his library, questions about his medals and the books he'd kept hidden from the public eye. She wasn't like the others. While most children fidgeted through royal obligations, Charlotte listened. She asked about royal history with a kind of reverence that caught the Duke off guard. In those early exchanges, he saw not just curiosity, but something deeper, a loyalty to heritage that reminded him of a fading generation. He never said it aloud, but those moments stayed with him. And as the years unfolded, they became something of a ritual. Afternoons spent reviewing old journals, letters exchanged during long summers, and private walks through lesser-known royal gardens, where the Duke shared stories never told in interviews or memoirs. It wasn't just Charlotte's questions that stirred him. It was her manner. Even at a young age, she held herself with quiet strength, never seeking to be the center, but somehow commanding the space she occupied. The Duke, who had long grown weary of the spectacle that modern royalty had become, found peace in her company. He began gifting her items never extravagant, always symbolic. A pin that once belonged to Queen Mary. A handwritten letter from George V 6th, preserved in perfect condition. These weren't mere trinkets. They were heirlooms that whispered trust and intention. And while others in the palace barely noticed, one person did, a longtime aide of the Duke, who later recounted in private how the Duke's face would soften when Charlotte entered the room. It was as if he was speaking to the future, the aide recalled. As Charlotte began appearing more frequently at formal engagements, the Duke's quiet approval became visible. He requested she stand beside him during a Commonwealth ceremony. He asked for her to carry a historic floral brooch that hadn't been worn in decades. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated nods to a legacy being shaped behind closed doors. The Duchess of Cornwall noticed. So did others. And though nothing was spoken publicly, a shift was unmistakable. The Duke had chosen his North Star, and it was Charlotte not by decree, but by devotion. But admiration wasn't the only force at play beneath this legacy transfer. Was a silent rejection of another branch of the family. For years, Camilla fought to bring her children closer to the crown, but the firm rarely budged. The Duke of Gloucester, in particular, held fast to royal boundaries. His cold distance wasn't personal. It was principle. But to those excluded, it felt like exile. From the very beginning, there was a line no one wanted to draw, but everyone could see. Camilla's children, Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopez, were her flesh and blood. Yet to the monarchy they were not truly royal, not by blood, not by title, and not by tradition. While the palace never voiced it publicly, behind closed doors it was well understood they would remain on the periphery. They attended weddings, yes, appeared in a few family portraits perhaps, but when it came to matters of legacy, inheritance, or institutional power, they were spectators, and no one enforced that boundary more rigidly than the Duke of Gloucester, a man whose reverence for bloodlines bordered on obsession. He held fast to the old codes. To him, lineage was not a flexible concept. It was sacred. Camilla, however, saw things differently. As her role evolved from companion to queen consort, she believed her children deserved recognition, not just as extensions of herself, but as future figures within the royal framework. There were subtle moves, invitations extended, public appearances organized, and conversations behind the scenes meant to plant seeds of inclusion. But each time those efforts came close to bearing fruit, a silent wall was erected, and often the mortar in that wall was laid by the Duke himself. He didn't speak ill of them, but his actions were clear. They were guests, not heirs, observers, not successors. Those tensions escalated over the years. At certain family events, Tom and Laura were given seats away from senior royals. Their names were rarely listed in official bulletins. During a gala that honored the Queen's closest circle, their omission from the guest list caused a quiet fury in Clarence House. Behind Camilla's composed smile was a growing sense of insult, of being reminded again and again that her children would never be embraced by the house she now represented. And yet it was at Gloucester family gatherings where the coldness was felt most acutely. An aide once noted that Laura arrived at a spring luncheon only to be ignored for hours, seated with distant cousins, while Charlotte was ushered to the Duke's side. That sense of dismissal became permanent the day the will was read. Not only had the Duke failed to include Tom or Laura, he had gone a step further, naming them directly and stating his intention that they receive nothing. It was an act that didn't need to be explained. The symbolism rang louder than any legal language. To the Duke, legacy was not something that could be borrowed through marriage. It had to be inherited through blood, through name, and through loyalty to tradition. And in his eyes, Charlotte embodied all of that and more. But if his estate was a fortress of tradition, what exactly had he left behind for Charlotte to inherit? This wasn't just about property. It was about power, memory, and monarchy. The Duke's estate includes some of the oldest private holdings in royal history. To give it to a child is one thing. To give it to Charlotte was a declaration of faith in her future as a monarch in waiting. When the details of the will emerged beyond the family circle, it became immediately clear that this was no ordinary inheritance. The Duke of Gloucester had not only passed down land and valuables, he had entrusted Charlotte with a sacred vault of royal identity. The estate was sprawling, touching corners of the country no longer marked on modern maps, with manors dating back to the Plantagenets, art believed lost in wars, and letters sealed with the insignia of monarchs long buried beneath Westminster. One estate in Norfolk had already drawn hushed speculation rumored to house Queen Mary's private collection of jewels, diaries, and correspondence never revealed to the public or even the Crown. And now it all belonged to a 10-year-old girl who up until now had been viewed simply as the spare to her brother's future. But that view changed the moment legal experts read the fine print. Financial independence had been built into the framework. Unlike other young royals who would rely on sovereign grants and trust funds carefully monitored by royal courtiers, Charlotte would stand apart. She would not just inherit wealth, she would command it. The estate, valued in staggering figures, was placed in a secure trust that would activate the moment she reached legal age, but its governance began immediately. She had been named permanent steward, a legal term rarely seen in modern royal documents, designed to signify responsibility rather than ownership. The intention was not to spoil, but to prepare, and the message was unmissable. Charlotte was being groomed not for comfort, but for command. Among the most shocking inclusions was a sealed vault on the Gloucestershire estate. Hidden from royal inventories, this vault reportedly contains a cache of unpublished royal correspondence letters from Edward VII, notes between George V, VI and Churchill, even rumoured annotations from Queen Elizabeth II during her early reign. Now under Charlotte's stewardship, access to these documents may unlock parts of royal history deliberately obscured for generations. Royal historians were left speechless. Palace aides, many of whom believed they knew the full extent of royal holdings, were blindsided. One senior advisor reportedly whispered, "This was not an inheritance. This was anointing her in silence." No formal ceremony followed. No press release clarified. But within the royal institution, the shift was undeniable. This wasn't about favoritism. It was about forecasting. The Duke had chosen to pour his legacy into Charlotte, bypassing Camilla's children entirely, and placing the weight of royal continuity on the youngest shoulders he trusted. And with that, the stakes rose. Because in one silent stroke, the Duke had done more than elevate a child. He had disrupted the future, igniting questions that the monarchy was not ready to answer. As Charlotte's star rises with unexpected speed, the decision sends shock waves and Camilla is no longer silent. Inside Clarence's house, a furious confrontation erupted, one not captured by cameras or chronicled by the press. Camilla, usually measured, was reportedly incandescent. In the hours following the revelation of the will, Camilla's restraint shattered. Sources close to the royal household confirm she demanded an immediate audience with Charles and senior advisors. No formalities, no diplomatic delay, just fury barely masked beneath protocol. Those present described the Queen Consort as pale with rage, her voice sharp and unrelenting. She didn't speak in whispers. She roared accusations. To her, the Duke's decision was not simply an expression of preference. It was an orchestrated humiliation. And as her words echoed through Clarence's house, the very foundations of royal unity began to shake. Camilla accused the family, especially Anne and Edward, of colluding to bolster Charlotte's position while diminishing her own children. "You've all made your choice," she reportedly said. "And it's not just about her, it's about them." Princess Anne, known for her calm but unwavering demeanor, did not stand idly by. Reports speak of a verbal exchange that turned icy fast. And reminded Camilla, perhaps too bluntly, that royalty isn't given, it's inherited, that titles cannot be bestowed by proximity or favor, and that while the family had accepted Camilla, it did not owe automatic reverence to those outside the line. Prince Edward too stood firm, making it clear the will was the Duke's final word beyond manipulation, beyond reversal. The confrontation left Charles caught between his wife's wrath and the immovable walls of royal tradition. He tried to comfort her, but made no promises. And that silence stung more than anything. In that moment, Camilla was no longer queen consort. She was a mother whose children had been publicly rejected. Privately, her fears began to swell. This wasn't just about a missed inheritance. It was about a legacy slipping through her fingers. For years, she had worked to elevate her position, to secure a place in history, not just for herself, but for her family. But now, the spotlight was shifting. Charlotte was no longer simply William's daughter, she was becoming something more. Camilla saw it for what it was, a changing of the guard. And with every whisper, with every tribute to Charlotte's maturity, grace, and queenly potential, Camilla felt her own foundation beginning to crack. Palace public relations scrambled in the aftermath. They issued no statement. But behind the scenes, advisors raced to contain the fallout. Phone calls were made. Journalists quietly warned off, but the damage was already bleeding into the press. Insider leaks. Unnamed sources, whispers of a rift none could deny. And as the monarchy braced for a tidal shift, one thing became certain, Camilla would not stay silent forever. This was personal now, and personal wounds never stay buried within palace walls. But just when the palace thought it could manage the fallout, another revelation ignited an even deeper crisis. Tucked behind a worn leather journal in the Duke's private study, a handwritten letter surfaced, sealed, dated, and addressed to my heir. The contents weren't legal, but personal. They revealed a truth the will couldn't say aloud, and a final blow to Camilla's ambitions. It was discovered by the Duke's trusted solicitor just days after the public commotion surrounding the will's contents. The instructions were clear. This letter was not to be opened until the legal formalities had been completed, and only in the presence of Princess Charlotte herself. The envelope was thick, aged slightly at the edges, and bore the Duke's wax seal. It was more than a final message. It was a confessional manifesto, one that would send shock waves through the private chambers of the monarchy. As the letter was read aloud, the room, small, silent, and filled with only the most trusted few, fell into a stillness that could only be described as sacred. In his own hand, the Duke wrote of a kingdom he feared was slipping, of bloodlines diluted by ambition, and of his decision to act not with malice, but with resolve. He wrote of Charlotte's unshakable grace, a phrase that would later echo through royal circles like a quiet storm. He spoke of a child wise beyond her years, of the strength she carried even when no one was watching, and of how she reminded him of the women who once built the crown from behind the throne. But there was more sharper, colder lines that cast shadows over Camilla's legacy. The Duke warned of those who seek status without sacrifice. A line so deliberate it required no clarification. It was a reference as clear as any royal decree. And while no names were mentioned, the implication was scorching. The Duke had seen through the performances. He had weighed the quiet dignity of lineage against the loud entitlement of proximity and made his choice. The letter didn't attack. It mourned in delicate aching lines. He expressed regret over lost time, over the distance that had grown between certain branches of the family. He wrote of broken trust and obligations betrayed not by scandal, but by vanity. And through it all, he returned to Charlotte, his heir, not because of her title, but because of her character. He tasked her with preserving a legacy that had been tainted by ego, reminding her that true royalty lies not in applause, but in restraint. The weight of his words was not lost on the girl. Those who witnessed her reaction described her as stunned, her eyes glistening as she read the letter herself, line by line, pausing often as the realization of her new role took root. This wasn't about land. This wasn't about wealth. This was about responsibility, and the expectations had just doubled. Within hours, word of the letter began to circulate among senior royals. Though never released to the public, its existence became legendary. A private torch passed in silence. For some, it was the final confirmation of what they feared. The Duke had rewritten the line of significance without permission. For others, it was the spark of a new story, one that centered not on tradition alone, but on merit. And while Camilla said nothing officially, those closest to her claimed she wept upon learning of the letter's content, not for herself, but because the door she had fought to open for her children had now been bolted shut with ink, wax, and a name not their own. But while one young royal rises, another royal figure watches with quiet determination and a secret plan of her own. Far from the drama, Catherine, Princess of Wales, began taking discreet but powerful steps. If the monarchy was going to survive, and if Charlotte was to inherit more than land, she would need protection, guidance, and a blueprint. Catherine was ready to provide all three. In the silence that followed the reading of the will, Catherine understood what few others could see clearly. This wasn't just a moment of inheritance. It was a moment of reckoning. The Duchess turned strategist. She arranged quiet meetings with royal historians, archivists, and long-serving tutors, piecing together an education for Charlotte, not just of facts and etiquette, but of resilience and legacy. Each lesson, each document, each name in the footnotes was chosen with purpose. The goal wasn't to create a perfect royal. It was to prepare a leader who would carry the weight of a title before ever wearing a crown. Catherine's movements were not dramatic. They were deliberate. Because if the institution was to survive the next century, it would need a future monarch who had seen behind the curtain far earlier than her predecessors. But the preparation wasn't only academic. There were nights when Catherine sat alone, reading the Duke's letter again and again. She saw how swiftly public affection could twist into resentment. How inheritance could feel like a target, not a gift. Charlotte would need armor, not of gold or diamonds, but of understanding and truth. Catherine began consulting Princess Anne, the only royal woman who had truly endured the expectations of monarchy without ever asking for its rewards. Anne's advice was sharp and unsentimental. Teach her to serve in silence. That's the only path that survives the noise. Those words became Catherine's compass. Still, as whispers of discontent grew louder, Catherine's instincts hardened. She knew Charlotte's inheritance had not only inflamed Camilla, but stirred jealousy in corridors where ambition still lingered. Catherine didn't wait for a threat to become visible. She brought in legal advisors, constitutional experts, even former aides of the Duke himself, ensuring the will could not be contested. Every loophole closed, every clause enforced. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection. And as the safeguards were quietly put into place, William began to see what Catherine had seen all along. This wasn't merely about wealth. This was about power. Together, they reached a new understanding. The days of raising their children away from the storm had passed. Charlotte was no longer just a daughter. She was a symbol, a pivot point. And what began as a family matter had transformed into a constitutional matter. The future wasn't abstract anymore. It was embodied in their child. Catherine didn't flinch. She leaned in. Every decision from now on would be made with the long game in mind. Because once history starts writing in ink, it never pauses for emotion. But in the shadows of legacy and inheritance, a question still remains. What does this mean for the future of the monarchy itself? In a monarchy that clings to tradition, it is often the subtle changes that speak the loudest. With one signature, the Duke of Gloucester rewrote the succession of influence, and in doing so, he may have handed the keys of tomorrow's crown to a little girl with royal blood and fire in her soul. The impact of the Duke's will was not confined to palace corridors or whispered family meetings. It echoed outward, touching the gilded circles of aristocracy and even brushing the fingertips of Parliament. What many assumed to be a personal choice quickly revealed itself as a tectonic shift in the royal power structure. Advisors from ancient houses, those whose family names were carved into centuries of monarchy, began re-examining their allegiances. A new undercurrent flowed through the upper tiers of British society. Not loud, not declared, but undeniable. Charlotte had become more than a royal child. She had become a focal point, a magnet for those who could read the winds before the storm arrived. And this wasn't a storm of chaos. It was a storm of change. Royal historians couldn't help but draw comparisons to another girl once overlooked. A young Victoria never expected to ascend, yet destined to redefine an empire. The similarities were haunting. Both possessed a precocious command of their environment. Both were quiet observers until destiny forced their hand. And both were raised under the watchful eyes of mothers who understood the dangers of royalty more than the privileges. Catherine, now perceived as a rising matriarch within the House of Windsor, became the quiet architect of a new narrative, one not centered on hierarchy, but on readiness. And in that narrative, Charlotte's visibility began to shift. Invitations to engagements previously reserved for heirs apparent. Inclusion in internal briefings. Mentions in press statements that once spotlighted George. It was subtle but deliberate. Inside the palace, the shift was felt with unease. Camilla, though still queen consort, now stood on symbolic thin ice. Her position was untouched by decree, but weakened by implication. The court's attention slowly turned from what had been expected to what now seemed inevitable. And among senior aides, conversations took on a new tone, one that hinted Charlotte might begin taking ceremonial roles even before her elder brother. It wasn't about line of succession. It was about favor, about presence, and about trust. William and Catherine's circle began to expand, absorbing allies, while Camilla's influence contracted. Not publicly, not loudly, but undeniably, the nobility began to realign old family names, quietly distancing themselves from associations that once seemed advantageous. The next royal generation was no longer a mystery. It was being formed, guided, and fortified. And while the public still looked to Charles and William as the stabilizing forces, those within the system began to ask a different question. Who truly is the soul of the future monarchy? For many, the answer was no longer in the crown. It was in Charlotte, a child chosen not just by blood, but by the final judgment of a royal traditionalist who had seen every corner of the institution and placed his trust in her hands. But the Duke's final legacy isn't just in what he gave, but in what he revealed about the battle for the soul of the crown. What began as a private will has become a defining moment in royal history. The Duke of Gloucester didn't just bequeath property, he passed on a torch. In Charlotte, he saw a monarch not yet crowned. In Camilla's children, he saw a line he refused to cross. The royal family will never be the same. In the days that followed the legal announcement, grief was overshadowed by reckoning. The family gathered, but the mood was fractured. Behind closed doors, conversations no longer flowed freely. Camilla kept her distance, and Charles wore the expression of a man who had accepted that his house would not heal with time. The Duke's absence was felt not just in protocol, but in power. He had been the quiet sentinel of the old guard. His final act now forced everyone to confront the future he alone had dared to define. The emotional toll was immense. Bonds frayed. Trusts once thought unbreakable, weakened. And yet amidst the division there stood Charlotte, poised, calm, and increasingly present. Not by command, but by quiet design. Public reaction was swift and intense. Some praised the Duke for his conviction, for choosing legacy over comfort. Others questioned his motives, painting his actions as outdated, even cruel, but most were simply captivated. The image of a young girl quietly elevated above older contenders stirred fascination. Commentators called it a royal reckoning. Newspapers ran headlines not about scandal, but about symbolism. And while legal teams stood ready to defend the will, no challenge came. The document was watertight. The Duke's instructions explicit, the law unyielding. Even Camilla's advisors knew there was no path forward that wouldn't end in humiliation. As the dust settled, Charlotte's public appearances began to increase. She joined her parents on official outings, attended services once deemed too significant for someone her age, and received nods of reverence once reserved for George. It was clear she was being positioned not as a backup, but as a bearer of heritage, and the people noticed. Her poise, her restraint, the way she seemed to carry the weight of history without ever being told to it, became the conversation behind palace doors. Meanwhile, Tom and Laura quietly disappeared from view. Where once they lingered at events or stood within the edges of family portraits, now there was absence, no statements, no appearances, just a silence that grew louder by the day. The Duke's will had done more than honor a child. It had redrawn the invisible map of royal gravity. Charlotte became a new center of it. Not simply a granddaughter, not merely a young royal, but a living answer to the question the monarchy rarely dares ask. Who is truly worthy of carrying its future? The Duke had made his answer known. And whether the world agreed or not, they were now watching her steps more closely than ever before. And as the sun sets on one royal life, it rises over the shoulders of a girl once overlooked, now holding the weight of a kingdom's future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.